Great. Well, it has been quite a day. I've gotten a few comments of people saying, my head is spinning, because it's been a little bit of rapid fire. So, we have that expression at MIT, it's like drinking from a fire hose. So we turned on the fire hose today. We have an amazing closing panel for you. And the point of this panel is to kind of take a step back, and I'd say take a step up, and to think about the future, to think about how we achieve that future and how we achieve it together. So I think inherent in this conversation is the concept of partnerships. And we've heard that word many, many, many times today in many different contexts. But I think this will be a great conversation. So we have 4 people up here, 2 from business and 2 from government. So starting at the end, we have Andrew Wishnia, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Next to him is Josh Sirefman, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Michigan Central. Next to him is Jamey Tesler, who's the Secretary of Transportation here in Massachusetts. And immediately next to me is Diane Hoskins, who's the Co-Chief Executive Officer of Gensler. So what I'd like to do is kind of start with maybe with the business angle. And I think, Josh, I think I'm going to start with you to tell me a little bit about sort of what is Michigan Central. So let's just start with that, because that, I think, baked into the strategy of Michigan Central is this concept of partnerships and experimentation and thinking about our mobility future. So tell us what's Michigan Central.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for picking me to go first. It's actually a really interesting setup to sort of say you're going to start with business and then start with Michigan Central, because we're kind of honestly in between all of those sectors, and our whole purpose for existence is really as a platform that blurs those boundaries across those. So just 2 seconds of context. Bill Ford had an extraordinary vision, a vision about that the mobility industry will increasingly need to work with each other to figure out the future. That then got merged with an opportunity to also have an impact at scale in the city of Detroit. And that manifested itself then ultimately in the purchase of an extraordinary building in Detroit, the Michigan Central train station, properties around it. But really what came out of that is this vision of an open platform to accelerate new mobility solutions. And that open platform is, I was listening to the whole panel around integration. We are a microcosm of how do you think differently about integration. And so yes, we've grown out of business, but we're this very unique model where there's a $1 billion investment from business intended to actually move the needle and involve government, involve companies across the spectrum, involve competitors, involve emerging entrepreneurs, involve community, all of the different layers into coordinated effort to think about those issues and solutions. So you're absolutely right. Partnership is our ethos. It's our reason for existence. And we're a very unique entity. I think I really haven't seen any others literally around the world where our whole purpose is to sort of catalyze different entities to partner together to start really solving problems and to give them the tools to be able to do that in a way that ultimately can lead to scale.
Okay, now this is not your first rodeo, so to speak. I mean, you really one of the founders of Sidewalk Labs, which did a lot of great work in this area. So when you reflect back, in terms of learnings from that experience, what are the you guys were doing your project in Toronto. So what do you take away from that?
How many of the 56 minutes do I have? There's so many. I think first and foremost. So I don't know if you're familiar with what we tried to do in Toronto. It's, I think, got an outsized amount of attention compared to the rest of our work. That's okay. I think we were ahead of our time. I think we were pushing the envelope in ways that really the world was not quite ready. But there's huge lessons. I think first and foremost, we were discussing this beforehand, in the context of public-private partnership, there is not a model yet that allows the private sector to take the lead in taking risk, and in taking risk in ways that lead into public policy, that lead into the domain that typically would be just the public sector. And that's a very, very hard muscle to build, and kind of sort of doesn't yet exist. And so I think in many ways, that's a huge takeaway from that experience. And I think a second of note, and again, I could keep going for hours, is that to truly do something different with material impact in the real world, literally it takes every actor involved to do things differently every day, every step, no matter how small and how major, to do it differently than they would. And that's not easy. And to sort of have the ability to sort of drive forward in the face of literally every aspect and every individual involved, whatever sector they're in, whatever level, sort of defaulting to the known, it's very difficult to push through. So, you know, we tried to do something that was very, very integrated, holistic. It was thinking about how do you create like the entirety of a neighborhood when you have this opportunity to leverage new capabilities, new ways of thinking.
Can you tell us a story just that illustrates that? Like something that happened that sort of paints that picture?
You know, there are so many. You know, I'll just one example. We wanted to create a neighborhood entirely constructed out of tall timber as a building material. Every aspect of the carbon profile for the use of timber at that scale, you know this better than I do, is extraordinary compared to concrete, steel, et cetera, all kinds of things. The reality is, and this, you know, 5 years ago, this is even more the case, there is no policy framework for it. There is no understanding in the Toronto context where the boundaries between city government, provincial government, federal government, of oversight. We had teams of literally 45 different individuals from 3 levels of government in sort of working sessions on a constant basis. And just to be able to try to get higher buildings that have never been built before in that market out of that material. And if you didn't manage that every second, it would just fritter away. And you had to, you know, there were probably a dozen different approvals just to get to sort of step 1 involved in that. And you know, the weight of the process,
yeah,
and you're reliant on this mass network of whether it's policymakers, politicians, staff, you know, you name it. Any one thing could derail the entirety of that sort of operation. And I could give you.
So for concrete and steel, because that's just been around for decades, no problem. There's a system that's developed to move that along. But with this new material, this sustainable timber, it just became an institutional mess.
Well, and you can translate to any of the, you know, a mobility capability, whatever it may be. It's new, and it's different, and it doesn't fit. So in that case, you've got building code. You've got an entire industrial complex of all the interest groups who sort of the economics of what they do, and it starts into that. You know, every dimension. And so without you have to get to the root of it. You have to have the policy structure for it. You have to then have how do you protect life safety. Now, obviously, you know, that's it's not a mobility example directly, but the same thing holds true across that.
Well, let's talk about a mobility example. So at Michigan Central, you guys are working on an electrified road. You're working on a kind of urban aerial mobility corridor with Windsor. Tell us about sort of how that's rolling out and what you're learning, even why, you know, why pushing those particular technologies?
I will, but just one quick other sidewalk example for the mobility crowd. We actually, our original proposal was that there's about a 400-acre area on the waterfront in Toronto, really yet to be developed, and that we would actually, it would be entirely autonomous vehicles, but also that your usage would be priced. So you'd actually be paying for, as you use the road, you'd be paying a fee for that. You that a bunch of ways. It would require creating a new governmental entity to sort of do that and figure there was zero capability to even think like, how do we even start to respond to that and think about making something like that work on the public sector side. At Michigan Central, and especially having lived through the sidewalk experience, it's an incredible step forward, because what we have here is it's my second go around of where the private sector is in the lead, but we've learned so much, and we have an approach that changes the dynamic. And so we have partners, the city of Detroit, the state of Michigan are very active partners at the table. In some cases, the federal government is. Across the industry, we've got all kinds of partners. So what we're doing is pulling together a series of, we've got infrastructure assets, so we'll have, for example, you mentioned with a company called Electron, inductive charging in the road, but that gives an opportunity to then, with other partners, create an autonomous transit shuttle that will use that as charging to sort of be the test thing, and we can layer other things on top of that. So we kind of, our general approach is we've got the infrastructure assets, we've got the digital connectivity, we've got the ability to capture data with transparency in the public realm. We've got the policy infrastructure, so whether that's transportation innovations or whatever the tools are. And then for us, we've got the social infrastructure, where we started with deep relationships with community. They're a part of the work, they're a part of the working process, they're a part of the sort of the ecosystem that we're creating. And with those tools in place, you can really start to do stuff.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to come back to that. I'm going to go over to Diane. So, okay, this is going to be a weird moment on the panel. I'm going to come out of the closet for you, Diane. You ready for this? So, I'm an engineer, but I'm actually a closet architect. So I'm really happy to have you on the panel, having studied architecture here at MIT. You're co-leading the largest architectural firm in the world, and you're thinking about kind of how do we design cities. So when you take that big step out and you think about the future of the urban landscape, how does transportation fit into that picture? And please feel free to reflect on the conversations that we had earlier today here.
Sure. It's so funny how many people are closet architects, or most of my clients actually. But seriously, it's great to be here, and it's been great to be able to be part of such an important conversation, and just kudos to the planners and all of the leaders who've been part of making this a really engaging experience for all of us. So, to kind of get into the conversation a little bit on the spirit of where you started, the vision, right? What is the real vision here? And we got into so much great nitty-gritty detail on, batteries and, what batteries are made of and what's going on as it relates to, barriers, as it relates to our transit systems or standardization and so on and so on. But really, what is the goal? And ultimately, the goal is that we want to create something that enhances the human experience, that makes things better for people. We don't want to have created EVs and AVs and micro, transportation so that life is worse, right? At the end of the day, we all have this great vision of that things are going to be better, our cities are going to be better. More than half the people on the planet actually live in cities now, not on farms and urban and rural areas. And so the city is really what we're talking about here, whether it's the city proper or the various rings of residential that we call exurbs or something. But that's all part of the urban area. And everything we're talking about in terms of the impacts of transit, transportation, mass transit, scooters, AVs, EVs, is going to be an impact on our cities. And, we believe that it's important to have some intentionality about where we end up. We don't just want to have more vehicles on the road or, more dangerous transit to ride on or so forth. And we believe that there's a possibility that all of this can mean that we're able to create more walkable cities. You know, we've done surveys, and we, you know, as a large architecture firm, we created the Gensler Research Institute about 15 years ago to really understand trends as it relates to the intersection of place and spaces and people and, you know, what they do, and to bring some analytics to that and to really get down into some tough questions, you know, wicked problems. And so we've been surveying, you know, people across 30 different cities, doing pulse surveys actually since COVID, and, you know, the latest one actually, I was looking at the data last week in coming to this meeting, and it actually is focused on mobility. And, you know, at the end of the day, people actually want to be closer to everything they do in their lives. They want to be closer to where they work, where they go to school, where they shop, where they play. And at the end of the day, the biggest disconnect between people wanting to come back to work right now is something called the commute. I mean, this thing that we're all describing here actually is considered a negative to most folks, that it's in between them and what they want to do. And this idea of the 20-minute city has really caught on globally, and it's a conversation that's going on that really is about this issue of proximity. And how do our transit systems, our you know, mix of land uses, all of that create the kind of proximity that is the lifestyle that most people literally around the world want to live. And so I put that challenge out there to all of us in this conversation, whether it's the battery life or where we charge our EVs or what's going on with public transit, that does it at the end result in that 20-minute city vision where people have greater proximity to the kinds of things they want to do in their lives, the way they want to be able to drop off their kids or, you know, again, go to dinner or go to lunch or all the things all of us want to do. So that's really our vision. And how do we, with the cities we have, which, you know, again, we're involved in creating and designing new cities, and that's a whole other conversation we should get involved with because of the speed at which we're needing to actualize these new cities. But in a lot of our existing cities, you know, how do we begin to think about the transformation? And working with many partners, whether it's actual, you know, city agencies, or frankly, people like Uber, or folks like BMW, or other entities out there that have, you know, an interest in an outcome that certainly is beneficial to them, and that we try to layer on the fact that this has benefits that go beyond just one bottom line, but maybe, you know, also tremendous benefits to society as a whole. And so, you know, when we look at how do we give our cities back to people, how do we give our roadways back to a walkable experience? The panel that was up here before, I think, was one of the places where there's a lot of conversation. Should we have dedicated lanes for buses, for, you know, the scooters, for the walkers, for the, you know, folks on, you know, on bikes? And then what happens to the car and the car experience if we put all those lanes in? People want to see an organized system. You know, we all know right now it's all in transition. The scooters land on the sidewalk. You got to watch your, you know, who's coming down the road, what mode they're in. But at the end of the day, the design community is being called upon to help sort this out and to help figure out where all these modalities land, and we want them all, and how do we make it a win-win all the way across. So that is a challenge that we're seeing, and lots of ideas are starting to be generated around how we create the places for all of these, that it's not an accident that somebody's on, you know, a scooter versus a bike versus a walking versus something else. That's, you know, hopefully a transitory moment that we're in right now. Then there's, you know, 100,000 intersections in the United States where there are gas stations. So what is going to happen to those gas stations, and how do we envision something that is more generative into those communities? Is it a place, you know, I mean, in many cities we don't have parks. or we don't have enough parks, or we don't have parks in lots of the places where we would like them? Is that a place where we could see some green, where we could start to have, maybe a place to take the dog or a place to relax, to come out of my office building? But, again, 100,000 intersections that have these gas stations, are we going to turn them all over to charging stations? Or are we going to find this transition opportunity to rethink how we want to experience our cities? And then we go to the parking lots. And, I was involved with Uber in this whole effort that they were moving forward with a couple of years ago, right before COVID, on looking at aerial mobility. And how were they going to think about integrating a system of aerial mobility into cities? And one of the ideas was actually to take parking garages that exist today and transition them to a place where that small plane could land, and also then what would happen, in the rest of that space, and really looking at how does that become a multimodal center, how does that become a place where there might be retail, there might be some logistics aspects to it, and also be a place for people. And, again, because if we are going to have, microplanes and there certainly is an argument in many respects of how that is another part of the system, especially in places like Los Angeles and getting from downtown to the airport and other places, and we see it in South America already. But, again, you've got to have places where these planes can land. But even beyond that usage, these parking garages are another opportunity to transition to uses that are more appropriate for today, whether it's, again, some type of logistics, centralized logistics, rather than things having to come to your specific house, that it's in your neighborhood and you're able to pick it up. Or other kinds of uses, ghost kitchens, et cetera, that are serving, the immediate community. And, again, really starting to look at the fact that here's this moment of opportunity, probably, something we haven't seen for 50, 60, 70 years, when the suburbs were built across the United States. Here is this moment where we know transformation is going to happen very quickly. And how do we intentionally use that moment to create a better city, to bring those things into the urban environment that create a city that has, better walkability, has green space, and also gives us room for things that we do today that we didn't do 10 years ago.
Wow, many concepts, really fascinating concepts there. I mean, when you walked into the room this morning, you met Dimitris from Ferrovia, and it's interesting because you guys are doing the design at Terminal JFK, and they're doing the build. So when I think about these types of companies, you guys work on buildings or you work on projects, this is really elevating up to say, we're working on cities. Right. We're working at the entire concept of how a city can actually work and be designed, which I think is fascinating. You mentioned the 20-minute city, I think that in Paris they narrowed it down to 15 minutes, but this concept of enhancing proximity and placemaking, thinking about what the gas station of the future can look like, is that actually a place where people might want to spend some time and the opportunities that affords. Okay, many fascinating concepts. We're gonna come back to that. Jamey, from the perspective of in Massachusetts. All right, so you, on the one hand, have these kind of big picture visionary ideas that are coming to you, and then on the other hand, you gotta fix the streets out there, and you have people saying, hey, we have problems with our streets, and that's still an important function. So how do you, reflecting a little bit on the first panel today, that tension between the physical, the built environment that's made out of concrete and asphalt and steel that we're used to, and this new digital environment, how are you thinking about that?
So let me first I want to build off something that Diane said, because I think it's really important and to give us an opportunity to think a little bit differently about the concept of mobility. Because I agree with the way you framed it, and I think it's really fundamental. And it answers a little bit of the vision, and it answers a little bit of how we conceptualize the daily life and the long term, which is, and it's hard for all of us because we're either, I wish I was an architect too, or an engineer, I'm neither, and we fall in love with building things. But fundamentally, we are a means to an end. We in mobility are a means to an end, whether it's our roads or our streets, or the transit system, or our airport, we are a means to an end. It's not what people are looking for. It is, we are there to connect. And my role in the cabinet for the governor is, I'm the enabling secretary. I'm not the one who's in NSL. I'm not education. We're not housing. We're not economic development. We're not the things that really matter in people's lives. We're the things that help the things that matter in people's lives. That is a really hard thing for our team to get. And one of the things that I say to people, especially here in Massachusetts with some of our key concepts, I'm in the housing business. They think I'm kidding. But we're not, because the most important choices are about where you want to live, how you want to work. No, I used to say where you want to work, because it's different now. And so before we get to the vision, you have to sort of, what's our identity? We're a means to an end. It's a hard thing, because the truth is, we want to build great infrastructure. We want to have infrastructure week every week. But the truth is, we have to kind of come to grips with what Diane said. Because then you can answer your question is, well, what's really our vision? How do we actually live in the day and get the work done in a way that cares for people, but also really have a vision? So first of all, you got to take care of what you own. You got to live with the daily responsibilities. We are a living, breathing, operating organization, whether we have a highway agency, we have a motor vehicle agency, we have an airport we run, or we have a transit system we run. And we get up every day and we live through it. Sometimes it's tough, and then we do it again. And you have to be mindful that it's an existing, living, breathing, really tough job, and that has to be the first job. And we have to motivate that, care for that, and recognize that people have those jobs. Those are tough jobs, they've gotten harder, and we all are dependent on the human capital of these organizations. Everything that I heard today is going to come back to people problems, and can we recruit more? To go to the vision, I want to kind of collect up a lot of different things that everybody touched on, because I think we all share it in a way, and I want to sort of boil it down to what we in MassDOT think about, what we in the Baker Polito administration think about, and I think it kind of gets us to some of the other things, and some of the things that Josh and Diane already hit. One is the concept of zero fatalities and serious crashes. This is important for us to embrace because it's actually possible. It actually can get done, and it is important to face it and stare at it and to work on it. We did yesterday, we do it every 2 weeks. Every single fatality in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, regardless of where it happens, we go through it, we look at the maps, we study it, we investigate it, and we learn from it. And it is painful, it's the worst meeting I had, but it's the most important job. Because in the long run, and it takes time, and we've seen this in other places in the world, and we are no different. I think that we believe it's possible, but I think it's important for us to embrace it. And many of you touched on safety issues, whether coming from an AV perspective or a technology perspective or some of the tools we're talking about. But I think we all have to begin with and embrace that vision in our cities and then in our states and then nationally, that it is actually possible to get there or to live near there. The second point is our climate goals. So we have them in law here, but we all share them in a lot of ways. A lot of the things we talked about, and again, I'm trying to connect up our dots. We have places we're expected to get to emissions reductions by 2030 in law. We have them by 2050. And we are only going to get there with many of the things that we heard today. But we're also going to have to adapt. We're going to have to adjust with the things that don't work. And my end, because things take time to build, we're going to have to remember that our role is means to an end. We are not the consumer who's buying the vehicles. We are not the user whose experience is going to be. And so we're going to have to be flexible with what ends up working, because this is going to be very fluid. The other things that we talk about a lot and just are really important to come through in everybody else's, we talk about mobility choices and maximizing them for people. That gives both the resiliency that was covered in the last panel, but it also gets to really building that 20-minute city. Not all of the above. mode shift, and we do need to think about how we achieve our climate goals with that. And I think one of the things that Diane touched on it, and I think Josh was getting close to it too. One thing I want to add too is all these goals have been really, really affected by the last 3 years, or close to 3 years now, of what the pandemic has accelerated. These were happening already. Work from home, remote work, really changes how we think about mobility. Because if we are just the means to the ends of where you want to live and how you want to do recreation or how you want to work if you're going to commute, well, that really changes that. And it doesn't mean that it's everybody who has that option or choice, but enough do now that we see it. One example, we used to think about it from a commute perspective, and we used to talk about traffic as a commute as if those were synonymous things, and congestion as if that was the same as commute and traffic. They're all different things. They happen in different ways. But we used to talk about a weekend pattern and a weekday pattern. We now have 3 patterns here. I saw data from Chicago. It's the same, and I think it's the same across metropolitan areas post-pandemic. We have a weekend pattern, we have a Friday and Monday pattern, and we have a Tuesday to Thursday pattern. Because you can really feel quickly the impacts on our commutes for those who still commute on those elbows of the weekend. They're different. E-commerce, we all know it, but it's important to talk about. It has dramatically increased, and that has significant impacts on the mobility system, and it impacts in a lot of ways. Safety, we've taken a major step backwards the last few years for lots of reasons, ranging from mental health to distraction to speed to changes in our streets. And all the goals that we're talking about have taken a setback. And ridership, transit ridership has not recovered across the board in the country. It's different in different modes, it's different in different places, but fundamentally, we all want to grow transit. People in the room have talked about mode shift and getting people out of cars. We haven't gone back to where we were in 2019, and we're a long way from there. So I just want to sort of take us through a couple of those points that sort of challenge all of us, and some of the things that I think have really accelerated on us. Those were already coming, they're here, and as we confront that vision for the future together, and some of the different things we've all talked through in the panels today, the impacts of the last few years is really bleeding through all of you.
So, Jamey, I want to reflect on this concept of transportation as a means to an end. And it's funny because I've been in mobility my whole career, and if you were to ask me, why does mobility matter? I could probably make the argument that mobility doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is access to healthcare, to education, to viable employment, to those things. And so how do we achieve that? Mobility is a very important lever for achieving that, but there's also proximity, and there's also digital connectivity, as we all learned so well during COVID. And so thinking about how to balance that portfolio of proximity, mobility, and connectivity in a way that gives people the things that they need is a very, very different role, I think, for a Secretary of Transportation than what it was in the past.
I think that's right, and I think it's going to be incredibly important for us to really study what these trends and differences are making. So one of the things that Diane was talking about, placemaking.
Yeah.
So we all think about that a lot in the mobility business. We think about that as we're an enabler and ability to create great places together with other investments. But what's changed is everywhere has to think about placemaking now. Because if you have the ability, and again, not everybody does, but a lot of people with a lot of net worth do, and a lot of people who have choices can live anywhere now and work some of the time from anywhere. So what the educational system's like in that community, what the housing stock and choices are, what the recreation and other choices, you have to compete community by community, area by area, place by place. And the importance of what we do to create places and to think about our role in mobility and infrastructure in even a deeper way than ever before, I think is profoundly important right now, because those choices are going to stay for people. And communities that were commuter communities or suburban communities, that concept I think is broken and changing beneath us. And regions are gonna have to compete by individual community on their assets, which isn't a bad thing, but a different concept.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're gonna come back to this thread. Andrew, so you're off to Sharm el Sheikh, you're thinking about, how do we decarbonize the transportation system in the US? And so from the perspective of the federal government, what are the types of kind of the levers that you guys are thinking about to accelerate that decarbonization?
It's great to be here with everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I think that there's a lot of visionaries here. Recognize a lot of names, a lot of faces. I was here last year to talk about what we were aspiring to do with respect to the bipartisan infrastructure law. And similar to sort of Diane's admonition to this group, our vision statement was to reduce trips, to create options to reduce trips, to shift trips, to improve trips, and to negate emissions. And as a result, we have the greatest investment of active transportation that the United States has ever seen. With respect to shift trips, we have the greatest investment of transit in American history. We have the greatest investment of rail since the inception of Amtrak. We have the greatest investment of charging infrastructure in United States history. And we have new definitional approaches for things like nature-based infrastructure to actually extract emissions out of the atmosphere so engineers don't have to guess what the definitional approach of natural infrastructure is. So I think what we've done is taken an all-of-the-above approach to look at ways beyond electrification for how to animate a strategy to reduce emissions so that we are having emissions by 2030 and getting to net zero emissions by 2050. I think that's thing one. Thing two is because of your thought leadership, because of the thought leadership of years, if not decades, since this point in human history, the time to act is now. So I would pivot a little bit. I think the RD&D is so extraordinarily helpful, but we are at an inflection point in American history at the risk of, speaking in hyperbole. We have unlocked $5 billion for EV charging infrastructure through a Federal Highway Administration formula program. We have 52 state plans, and I can't emphasize that enough. 52 state plans. If anybody in this room would have thought that we would have had 52 state plans from every state in the union, including DC and Puerto Rico, I think people would have thought you're crazy a year ago. But we've, through the Secretary's leadership, through the President's leadership, we've depoliticized electrification to such an extent that every single state submitted an electrification strategy, which was approved and certified by the Federal Highway Administration. It's an extraordinary feat, but the time to act is now. So one thing that I wanted to leave this group with is, if you talk to every state DOT in the country, the vast majority of state DOTs do not want to own and operate their charging infrastructure. They want to make sure that the thought leaders out in this audience, that the EVSPs across the country, the folks who actually know EV charging infrastructure and who can integrate it into the transportation infrastructure network, that they're the ones that are leading the charge here. And so as a result, our admonition to you is to work with your State Department of Transportation, work with utilities, work with folks up and down the supply chain, because we need your thought leadership as to where to install, how to solve for equity, to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits go to underserved populations, overburdened populations, to ensure that there's the right kind of consultation with localities, with tribes. The vast majority of the charging infrastructure built out in this country is going to be vis-a-vis public-private partnerships. So everyone has a stake in the solution here. It's up to designers, it's up to planners. The reason why we had this go to the Department of Transportation is because we want EV charging infrastructure to be seen as part of the transportation infrastructure solution of the 21st century. I spoke about the past. 5 years ago, this notion that EV charging infrastructure was part of transportation infrastructure, provoked some some humor. That's no longer the case. Times change so quick. The definitional approach of broadband has changed, as we've heard. The definitional approach of charging infrastructure has heard. The definition of mobility, as we see it going forward, is changing fundamentally at the Department of Transportation. So what I would, leave this audience with is make sure that you understand procurements are going out as soon as next month. We need to make sure that everyone is at the table. RD&D is great. It's important. Do not want to dismiss it. We can crawl, walk, run at the same time. We need to make sure that we take advantage of this moment. $5 billion unlocked now. Also want to mention there's another $2.5 billion that we're going to try to release later this year vis-a-vis discretionary grants. We have a community grant program and an alternative fuel corridor program. Each one of those grant programs is $1.25 billion, so collectively that's $2.5 billion. It's something that a lot of folks have been thinking about for a number of years. Those are coming out in a matter of months, if not weeks. We have a federal advisory committee, electric vehicle working group. We have an open rulemaking for electric vehicle standards, which is going to create a minimum floor for the EV charging infrastructure standards within the United States. We just have such a special and unique moment to change the course of our of the way that we move people and goods. And I want to implore the folks in this room to take advantage of this moment because it's a new paradigm, it's a new supply chain for who's at the table. Who's at the table includes everyone in this audience.
So, and I think there are many in this audience who will be very, very interested. My question for you would be, if we reflect back to a year ago when you were here, it was literally the day after the infrastructure bill was passed. And so here we are a year later. How do you think about optimizing, for example, that $5 billion? So how do you think about, how do we make sure that it is deployed with maximum impact? I would feel, honestly, if I were in your shoes, that's a really complicated question, right? Like, how do we maximize the value, the return on investment from all of this taxpayer money? How do you guys think about that?
The good news is we've had folks thinking about this for many, many, many years. I came from the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, where on behalf of Senator Carper created, with colleagues, the Clean Corridors Act, which ended up becoming part of this $7.5 billion investment. The president has given us a charge of, no pun intended, 500,000 chargers by 2030. So we take a step back from that and we say, the president's given us that commendation, 500,000 chargers by 2030. What are our values that animate that installation? Well, we want those chargers to be accessible to everyone. We want them to be convenient and close proximity to as many folks as possible. We want them to be reliable, right? We want to mimic to the greatest extent possible the National Highway System experience, but we actually want to improve on that. We want to make EV chargers human-centered, user-centric, available to all at as many hours of the day as possible. So I think if you take sort of the vision statement and then you back into that, the legislative authority that we've been given, we have a unique opportunity through rulemaking to create EV chargers that work for everyone. I think you're absolutely right, John, that there are big hopes in this space. And I think we need a candid conversation. Later on tonight, I'll be having a conversation along with colleagues with NAACP. I think equity undergirds all of our investments, and nowhere is it more acutely felt than in the technology space. Because it turns out a lot of times in technology, the beneficiaries of that technology are folks that look like myself. I'm Hispanic, but have Hispanic, but for the vast majority of minoritized communities, they're not able to take advantage of EV charging as quickly as we are. So I think we need an earnest conversation about how everyone benefits. And the President's Justice 40 initiative hopes to address that by making sure that at least 40% of the benefits go to underserved and overburdened communities. And that's something that we're endeavoring to accomplish, not just within the $7.5 billion, but across all of our electrification portfolios. Lastly, to that point, we just released $700 million through the Port Infrastructure Development Program. The $7.5 billion gets a lot of sort of front page cover, but it turns out that we have electrification opportunities across our DOT nodal administrations. So the Port Infrastructure Development Program, we just announced $700 million. That includes funding for a variety of transportation electrification opportunities. We funded electrification opportunities in the Port of Oakland, Port of Long Beach. So we really need to be looking at a system of systems approach, and that's something that we're doing, whether we're looking at transit applications, maritime applications, or highway applications.
Okay. Let's bring it back. So we touched on so many different themes here. Josh, I'm just wondering, do you have any sort of reactions to what your colleagues just said?
I want to make sure I get your phone number before we go. That's a lot of billions. No, it's super exciting. I mean, it's easy to focus on the work that you're doing right in front of you, and it's very helpful to sort of, as you said before, elevate. These issues are so interconnected, and so we have to approach them in ways that don't follow the normal models. And it's fascinating the way that you're setting up for the private sector to respond. I'm not sure on their own, and we see that in our work every day. There's companies doing all kinds of interesting things, but they need help, and they need to understand how does their work connect to this provider or that piece of the supply chain or the customer, or how do they think about equity, and how can they be helped in that. Just the interconnectivity is extraordinary. And I don't know, I think absent if we don't create literally new models for how to actually do that, it will not get us to that vision, it will not get us to sort of the transformation that you described.
And this concept of placemaking that Diane was talking about, does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it feels a little bit like it's a given at this point, right? We have to create great places. I think, we could go down a lot of directions. The 20-minute to 15-minute neighborhood is a wonderful aspiration. We also have to figure out how folks who are a long way from 20 minutes from all the things that they want in their life can also have access to that. And you have to start connecting the dots between all of these challenges that sort of have that holistic approach. But I do think you can't separate the place from the people, from the mobility as a set of tools to access stuff. It's all. So I think it can be overwhelming. You got to really think about things as a singular organism.
Well, just to maybe build on that a little bit, these things do really connect. And, there's something going on right now that it's born out of something that we're not so excited about, but it actually could lead to something very good. And there's a mobility story here too. But, with the slower return back to office buildings, you talked about that pattern and the pattern that everyone's seen. What has happened in the commercial real estate business or the office real estate business is that, the Class A buildings or the newest buildings are getting leased and are, still very desirable. But the kind of Class B and below are now really, in some cases, we could call them stranded assets or definitely devalued. But what's happening in many cities right now is an effort to look at, could these buildings become residential buildings? Could, we have a pretty significant housing shortage in most of our cities. Could we actually fill some of that need through transitioning some of these office buildings into residential? We've actually created an analytic at our firm where literally in 20 minutes we can test to see if your office building is even worth going down through a process of really doing drawings and getting to a next level of exploration. But we worked with Calgary actually, who has a 30% office vacancy rate. That's a very high rate. In a normal economy, 10%, 5% is where you want to be. I think when Detroit declared bankruptcy, it might have had an 18% office vacancy. So when we're talking, past 20, getting into the 30s, that's a problem for any city. Your tax base is now being eroded significantly by these empty office buildings. Anyway, so we worked with them to look at their building stock and helped them to develop actually an incentive program which is giving resources to developers and building owners who own these buildings that give them, there can be a little bit of a gap from an economic standpoint to go ahead and make that transition, do the things that need to be done to turn those into resi. But that's what's going on. Literally, we're testing thousands of buildings now across the United States and into Canada. And other architecture firms are doing this, I'm sure, as well. But here's something where, this is this transitional moment. This is, there's excess of something and there's a need for something else. And how can we start to marry the places where there's, too much of something, turning it into something that we need? And it actually accelerates the production of housing because you don't have to build the building. You also have a great carbon story there because, the office, the built environment accounts for about 40% of carbon globally. I mean, that's a number that's been tested and it's true. It is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases on the planet. There's a lot of focus in the built environment on how do we reduce that number. It's made up of two parts: how we operate our buildings, how we build our buildings. So if we use existing buildings, then we don't have to spend all of that energy to create the steel and the concrete to create a new building. So, again, it is a really important strategy right now in all of our cities, both from a carbon emission standpoint as well as on this use case issue. But there's a hitch. We have many cities where there's a zoning change that has to occur for that building to become a residential building. And there are cities that are slow to make those changes. So, again, from a policy standpoint, we really have to accelerate the ability to transition how we're looking at land use and approving land use changes, whether it's that gas station turning into a park or that parking garage turning into a data center or an office building turning into a residential building. We have to get much more nimble because one, it's going to allow us to bring productive uses to people, but also in many cases solving problems that we need to solve.
So overall, you're kind of, let's say, bullish on this opportunity to transform underutilized office space into residential space.
Absolutely.
But there's this important obstacle of just local and very highly localized municipal building codes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'll go one more step and then I can, but so the next piece really is about how does that all connect up with transit? Well, the other part is we need density in our cities. If we're going to have the proximities that we need, that people want, they want this, then we actually have to put in transportation systems that can move people at the scale that creates the kind of densities that provide the kind of economic incentive for all the stores and restaurants and all the other doctors and people who create the kind of environments people want to be in. That is a transit decision. That's a transportation decision. That's obviously a huge investment. It's also why New York has the lowest carbon footprint of any work environment. We've been studying kind of the carbon footprint of work. We're going to come out with a paper very soon on this issue, looking at, is it better to work at home or is it better to work in the office? When you look at the carbon and the commute, you add it all together, New York comes out better than any other city in the United States, and it's all about the density. In a lot of our cities that have, very different density patterns, there's a real challenge around, the actual carbon involved in going to work or even running your house for work, frankly, and then all the commute aspects in the middle.
So Jamey, I see you have a reaction. I just wanted, if any of you have questions, let's queue up maybe one or two questions right at the end.
Yeah, and you just hit it, and just the point there is that we have to all be careful about the trips issue versus commutes. Just because people aren't commuting doesn't mean they're not doing the same or more trips, which could mean more or greater or different places for impacts, which is, we have shifted volume, we haven't really eliminated it. People still do a lot of the things they want to do. The other thing I just want to build off your point when it comes to some of the Class B and C space is those have the bones of existing transit networks typically, because that's where people were commuting to work. And so whether it's a bus network in certain urban areas or a light rail or a subway network in cities like this, you have those bones of the system. That's the really other exciting part. And you have the bones of the retail network, who are our most burdened businesses, small businesses who've been hurt most by the pandemic, are exactly in those places where they have those vacancies. So you have those catalytic effects, and that creates that feedback loop for ridership that transit is currently missing. There's an and. We do have to rethink the bus networks, and we're doing that here. And you have to rethink a little bit of your transit and commuter rail systems, because that means there's different trips. If you're reutilizing some of that space, you're also changing some of the trip types. And so it's a great place to build upon, because you have those strengths. And rebuilding in our downtowns is a wonderful opportunity. But we have to also, on the transit side, rethink then the theme that I've been touching on, you touch on, and someone's touched on is, but then you have to understand the customer, where do they want to go? They're still going to use your system, then they're just going to make different trips. And your bus network has to be different, and your transit system might be different moves and different times of day. So we have to be adaptive with that.
Any questions from the room? Juan, go ahead.
Yeah, Assistant Deputy Secretary. So, I mean, just fantastic momentum, right, on everything you outlined. As these things come out onto the marketplace, what's your view, and also here in Mass, in terms of some of the regulatory tweaks that have to happen in order to drive action, as you say? Because you might have the funds, might be a lot of interest from different actors to come in, but the framework hasn't changed, right? The regulatory framework hasn't changed, and then that becomes a barrier.
Yeah, just in case folks didn't hear, the question was about, and where are you from?
Here in Boston, and I work for a company called Alpha Structure, so we build infrastructure.
Question was about regulatory tweaks, that are needed now and going forward on electrification. It's a great question. So here's what Congress required. Congress required within 90 days for the Department of Transportation to provide guidance on the $7.5 billion that we're giving to state departments of transportation. And then within a year, they required us to develop minimum standards vis-a-vis regulations. So that's the process that we're undergoing right now. There's an open comment period to define what charging stations look like alongside the national highway system and so-called community charging in urban cores or in rural areas. That has to do with the kilowatts on the charging station, how many miles between the charging infrastructure, what the workforce looks like, where those chargers are located, and so on. So we'll have more to say, hopefully soon, on minimum standards. There are questions related to Buy America that we're working assiduously on as well. And all of that is required before states go out with their procurements, so they know exactly what it is that the federal government's looking for. And so we have national uniformity in creating that kind of safe, accessible, reliable system. One other thing I wanted to leave this crowd with, recognizing that we're butting up against time. One thing I wanted to talk about was the public-private partnerships and the opportunities today. The other thing I just briefly wanted to mention is it's not every day you get to work in government in basically what's tantamount to a startup. I manage, along with my counterpart at the Department of Energy, a new office called the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. The reason I mention that is because I think it's helpful to everyone that's in this crowd. So you guys might want to write down driveelectric.gov. Driveelectric.gov is the new domain for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. That's where we are providing technical assistance to tribes, to localities, to states, and to the private sector about how we're thinking about deploying charging infrastructure. It's also a place where we're going to be unveiling, potential grant opportunities going forward. Can't say too much more about that, but
This is Gabe's office?
this is Gabe Klein's office, who was just announced as the new executive director for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. We're looking to work with the private sector, and we think that there's abundance of opportunities when we're talking about smart cities, when we're talking about reliability, when we're talking about really visioning for the future, which I think is some of the thinking on this stage.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to just close with one comment, one quick reflection here, and that is, if we were to look back 10 years, going backwards, your job, I think, Diane, would be quite different. You'd be thinking about a very different set of issues than what you just reflected on. I'd say that for everybody on this panel, but Josh, your job wouldn't even have existed, right? So I think what it shows is that we are slowly but surely kind of reframing these questions. I loved your comment about, I'm actually the Secretary of Housing, and really trying to explain that to people, and looking at this challenge of the future of mobility, but from a very broad kind of systems perspective.
And your point, there's a couple things. If you take that 10-year slice, so bike share started in Boston in 2011, New York 2012. It's a huge element of our mobility system that barely existed.
Yeah.
Uber founded in 2009, huge impact in what we do and choices that people have as we think about our system. What we do, 10 years to build a project, if it's a multi-billion project, that's what we talk about when we talk about building a massive bridge, or it's some of our huge things. Our time zone is really different than a lot of you in this room, and so 10 years is a blink in the infrastructure land, sadly sometimes, and it needs to be faster. But I think I just kind of cap your point with, and so things do move dynamically. It doesn't feel that way
Yes.
for many people. But we are, we have bridges in the Cape we need to fix. They're 100 years old.
Yep.
Things last forever in what we do when we build assets. And so we just have a different time view and perspective on a lot of the conversations I hear today. And that's why I think, to build off Josh, the last thing we know over time is we have a can't afford to fail system. It's sort of the opposite of too big to fail. So we are risk averse. We don't partner wonderfully always. But there's good reason for that, because what we do endures.
Fabulous. Okay, well, we are at time, so I want to thank all of you so much for this